Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 257 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today, I'm primarily looking at the first 4 chapters of the book of Esther. Now, I've been waiting, and this is, again, one of these portions of Scripture where each chapter of Esther could be an entire sermon in and of itself, but I just want to give you some of the highlights. The story of Esther already presents a little bit of a difficult situation when it comes to Bible scholars, and that is that God is not mentioned anywhere in the entire story. Well, at least he's not mentioned in written form. But I believe that we find the Lord all throughout the story of Esther. We almost catch that same glimpse as I mentioned back in the story of Ruth, where Ruth shows God's law being enacted on a daily basis and just ordinary everyday life. We kind of get a little bit of that sense of God's involvement in people's everyday life, how the Lord sets the stage, if you will, as the events unfold in the book of Esther. Now, this is after the Hebrews have been given their freedom to return back to the land of Israel, back to the city of Jerusalem, and already we saw when King Darius or Cyrus, when he helped the Jews really rebuild the kingdom. But now we're dealing with those who chose to stay, those who did not leave the Medo-Persian Babylonian Empire. And so we find ourselves in the district or city of Susa, and we have now a new ruler, King Xerxes, or some will call him Ahasuerus. So King Xerxes, just for the sake of ease, and more commonly we're used to that term, he holds a great banquet lasting over 100 days. And it's sort of just this drunken revelry party which he's having. And at some point, the men at the party, they're talking about the beautiful women of the land. And he says, "Oh, my queen, Queen Vashti, is the most beautiful of all the women in the land." And the men may have a look of like, "Well, I don't know about that." Either way, he says, "Bring the queen here." But the queen refuses to come to the king's party because she's hosting her own little banquet and party for the women. But I think there's many different reasons why she likely refused to go to her husband's party. And this resulted in not only him dethroning Queen Vashti, but making a new rule, an edict, that the women of the land must obey their husbands. Now, you would think that was already a law, but at least it is now in written form, and we're not told exactly what the punishment would be, but it would seem that that was not a good outcome. So now that his queen has been removed from her seat, the search for a new queen incurs. And this is when we're introduced to the 2 main characters of this book: Mordecai, a Jew, and Esther, a Jew. And Esther is, of course, Mordecai's niece. We're not given all the details of what happened to her parents, why her uncle is raising her. We don't know that situation. But Mordecai encourages Esther to beautify herself, to present herself as one of the women for this beauty pageant for the king. And of course, we know in the text that Esther ends up becoming the queen and replaces Vashti. But now for the protagonist of the story, we are introduced to a man by the name of Haman. And Haman is a descendant of an important character going back to the days of King Saul, and that is Agag. And you may remember Agag, the king, he was to have been destroyed. He was to have been killed by King Saul. All of the people, everything. The Lord said, wipe it all out. And yet he did not do that. And that was the very act that really ended up solidifying his removal from being the king. He had already done a number of things that had set the ball in motion for him being removed, but that was the final act. And this Agag was the one whom Samuel would end up drawing the sword of the king and hacking Agag to pieces. But we don't know how much time transpired, or some of Agag's household must have still been left alive, because this is how we get Haman. And now, what if the command of the Lord had been followed? Would we have had Haman? Well, maybe somebody else would have come to power, but no, Haman is a result of Saul's disobedience. So it's just something to note, because it isn't really pointed out in the story, but it is a point of notice of how this comes about. So Haman is going in and out of the king's courts. He's an official of the king, but there is one man, as Haman comes back and forth through the doors of the court, who will not bow. And that man is none other than Mordecai. And when Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, then he persuades the king to sign an order that all the Jews are to be killed. And they roll a dice to decide the day that they will be killed. And Pur, P-U-R, is the Hebrew word for dice. And that's where we get, if you've heard of Purim, that's where it comes from. And so now that the fate of the Jews has been decided, that all of them will be killed because of Mordecai's failure to bow before Haman, and I believe the text isn't quite clear. This is one of these things that we have to sort of understand the history, is that I think Mordecai is not bowing for two reasons. One, because Haman is a man full of pride, and Haman was expecting the people to bow before him. And the other is, I think that Mordecai knew the story of where Haman came from, that he was a descendant of Agag. And I believe that's why he refused to bow. Now, obviously, he, as a Jew, as somebody fearing God, wouldn't have bowed in the first place, because who is this man that you should bow before him? So now that Haman has put forth this order through the king and has permission to kill the Jewish people, now when this news comes to Mordecai, Mordecai goes into a deep state of prayer, wearing sackcloth and ashes and a sunken face. And when his niece sees him like this, as she looks out the window of the palace, she wants to know, why is my uncle doing this? To forward to Esther finding out in the news, a real part of the story comes to the point when Mordecai, maybe even just thinking out loud almost, says, who knows, maybe you have been appointed queen for such a time as this. And I think that's where we really begin to see God at work in the background. That it's like Mordecai suddenly realizing, wait a minute, this may be the very reason why my niece is the queen. And bravely, Esther now takes the situation at hand and begins to come up with a plan. Because she, even though she's queen, she can't just go before King Xerxes herself. She must be summoned, and she comes up with a plan. And we're going to see more of that plan unfold tomorrow. But I want you to realize that God is still at work, even though he's not mentioned. And this is very much how the Lord's at work all the time around us. And we need to trust him. We need to consider that maybe you have been put in the place that you're in just for a time to be used by the Lord. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.